In the years leading up to World War II, as tensions mounted across Europe and Asia, militaries around the world began exploring innovative methods of warfare. The Soviet Union, facing the looming threat of Nazi Germany and Japan, was no exception. The USSR, led by Joseph Stalin, was building a vast and complex military apparatus to defend its borders and protect its ideological and territorial interests. But, as war became imminent, Soviet military planners sought unconventional solutions to bolster their war efforts. One such solution came from an unlikely source: animals. The idea of using animals in military operations was not new. During World War I, animals were employed in a variety of roles, from carrier pigeons used for communication to dogs trained as sentries. However, the scale and utility of animals in warfare took a more prominent role during World War II, as technological advancements and tactical innovations began to push the boundaries of what could be done with living creatures. In the Soviet Union, which was rapidly militarizing and preparing for the war against Germany, the concept of utilizing animals became an essential part of the war effort. One of the most notable programs initiated by the Soviet military was the development and deployment of anti-tank dogs. The Soviet Union faced a dire need for resources and equipment, as the German army's mechanized divisions were proving incredibly effective against Soviet forces. The Wehrmacht's tanks and armored vehicles were powerful and difficult to counter, prompting the Soviet. Additionally, the Soviet military began utilizing messenger pigeons, which had been used in various military conflicts for centuries, to facilitate communication over long distances. This reliance on animals represented not only the desperation felt by the Soviets, but also the ingenuity with which they adapted to the challenges of warfare. While Soviet military strategies were largely focused on industrial production and manpower, the use of animals illustrated an interesting intersection of military tradition and necessity, where the ingenuity of human minds intersected with the capabilities of animals to create novel solutions in wartime. As the German invasion of the Soviet Union began in June 1941 with Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet military, caught by surprise, was forced to make rapid and unorthodox decisions to turn the tide of the war. This is where the use of animals, in particular anti-tank dogs, were part of a larger attempt to combat the overwhelming power of the German blitzkrieg, while messenger pigeons played a vital role in maintaining communication across vast and often disrupted front lines. At the heart of these strategies was the recognition that Soviet manpower was being drained by the relentless German offensive. As the Soviet Union's human resources were stretched thin, animals, seen as expendable yet effective, became an asset in the Soviet arsenal. Though controversial, these initiatives reflected the dire circumstances the Soviet Union faced in the early days of World War II, and underscored how the military-industrial complex of the USSR sought to utilize every available resource in its fight for survival. The integration of animals into military operations was a direct response to the Soviet Union's vulnerabilities at the time. Inadequate resources, lack of sufficient anti-tank weaponry, and the need to protect an increasingly vast territory from the German onslaught. In this context, the use of animals like dogs and pigeons served as symbolic of the larger Soviet effort to adapt and survive in the face of unprecedented military challenges. The impact of animal-based strategies, particularly the use of anti-tank dogs and messenger pigeons, would become a unique and often misunderstood aspect of Soviet military history. While the use of animals was not without its flaws and ethical concerns, it represents an intriguing chapter in the history of World War II, where creativity, desperation, and resourcefulness intersected on the battlefield. The extent to which these strategies influenced the course of the war is still debated, but their inclusion in the Soviet war effort highlights the resourcefulness that characterized the nation's struggle against Nazi Germany. Thus, as the Soviet Union prepared for the brutal confrontation with the Germans, animals became indispensable in various roles, from carrying messages to delivering deadly charges to enemy vehicles. These strategies also spoke to the nature of Soviet propaganda and their emphasis on total war. The idea that all resources, human or animal, were critical to the survival of the state. As the war progressed, these unconventional tactics would come to be a part of the wider narrative of Soviet resilience and adaptability. The opening phase of Operation Barbarossa, which began on June 22, 1941, marked the largest military invasion in history. The Wehrmacht, numbering over 3 million men, launched a brutal attack on the Soviet Union, initiating a campaign that would last for years and result in devastating consequences for both the military and civilian populations. For the Soviets, the early stages of the war were characterized by confusion, a lack of preparedness, and a rapid retreat in the face of the German offensive. In this environment, where the usual military protocols were thrown into disarray, Soviet planners began to turn to unconventional solutions, including the use of animals in warfare. The first use of anti-tank dogs began during the earliest days of the war, as the German blitzkrieg swept across Soviet territory. The Soviet army faced severe difficulties in combating the German panzer divisions, which had the capacity to crush Soviet forces with their advanced tanks and armored vehicles. Soviet commanders, with limited resources to counter the heavily mechanized German forces, decided to train dogs to carry explosives and run under German tanks, detonating the charges to disable or destroy the vehicles. The concept was born out of necessity, as the Soviets sought every available avenue to slow down or stop the German advance. The idea was simple, but grimly practical. The dogs were trained to recognize the smell of gasoline from the German tanks, and they were conditioned to run underneath them, at which point the explosive charges they carried would be detonated, destroying the tanks or damaging their mobility. This tactic, while innovative, was not without its challenges and ethical dilemmas. Training the dogs was a difficult and time-consuming process. The dogs had to be trained to not only run under tanks, but also to ignore distractions like food and the loud noise of battle. Many of the dogs were subjected to the intense stress of war, with some even being trained to react in increasingly violent ways, often resulting in their deaths, along with the destruction of the enemy tanks. Despite the grim realities of the anti-tank dog program, it became an essential part of the Soviet defensive strategy in the early days of the war. While the total number of tanks destroyed by these dogs remains unclear, it is evident that they caused significant disruption to the German forces, particularly in the early stages of the conflict. The Soviets were able to deploy these dogs in various regions, including the front lines of the major battles like the defense of Moscow and Stalingrad. However, despite the apparent success of the program, it was not without its drawbacks. Many of the dogs did not survive the missions, and many Soviet commanders were initially unsure of the dog's effectiveness, questioning whether the tactic was worth the cost in both human and animal life. Additionally, there was the constant issue of training efficiency. The program required substantial resources to train the dogs, and the results were not always guaranteed. Still, the program symbolized the desperate measures that the Soviet Union took to fend off the Nazi advance during the opening phase of the war. At the same time, the Soviet Union faced other logistical challenges, and their use of animals extended beyond just anti-tank dogs. Another key animal utilized by the Soviet military during this phase was the messenger pigeon. During the early days of the invasion, the destruction of communication infrastructure became a significant issue for the Soviets. The Germans, employing advanced air raids and artillery bombardments, sought to disrupt Soviet lines of communication, effectively isolating units and hindering the ability of the Red Army to coordinate. To overcome this, the Soviet Union turned to pigeons, which had been used for communication in wartime for centuries. The Soviet Union's use of pigeons in World War II was based on their proven ability to carry messages over long distances, even in adverse weather conditions. These pigeons, often trained at military stations, were used to carry written messages from one unit to another, bypassing the need for telegraph or radio communication, which could be intercepted or destroyed. Despite the technological advances of the era, the pigeons' reliability in delivering messages quickly and securely made them a vital part of Soviet communications. They were particularly effective in situations. Civilians in the war-torn Soviet Union also played a role in the maintenance and training of these animals, particularly messenger pigeons. In areas that had not yet been occupied by the Germans, civilian volunteers and families were often tasked with caring for and training these pigeons to deliver messages. This task, while seemingly minor compared to the larger military efforts, was an essential part of the Soviet communication infrastructure during the war. Many of these pigeons were bred and raised by civilians who viewed them as a vital link between the Red Army and the rest of the Soviet war effort. While the primary focus during this initial phase of Operation Barbarossa was on countering the German military threat, the use of animals highlighted the extent to which the Soviet Union leveraged every available resource, including living creatures, to secure its survival. The tactical importance of animals, such as the anti-tank dogs and messenger pigeons, is often overlooked in the broader history of the war. Still, they were emblematic of the desperate measures that the Soviets took during this period. As the war continued, the use of animals would evolve and expand, with the Soviet Union incorporating even more animals into their military operations, particularly in the brutal winter months when the Germans struggled with logistical and environmental challenges. The dogs, pigeons, and other animals would continue to play significant roles as the war entered its second phase in 1942, when the Soviet counteroffensive began to take shape. These animals, initially seen as a last resort, would become symbols of Soviet ingenuity and resilience. The dogs, though not always successful in their missions, were an embodiment of the Soviet will to fight. For the civilians, their involvement in training and maintaining these animals underscored the total mobilization of the Soviet Union, where every citizen, whether human or animal, played a part in the war effort. Through these efforts, the Soviet Union demonstrated its capacity to adapt and innovate, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The use of animals in warfare was a testament to the resilience of the Soviet military and the civilian population, who were forced to think outside traditional military doctrines to confront the scale of the German invasion. It is a story of survival, ingenuity, and determination, one that often goes unnoticed in the grander narrative of World War II, but was integral to the Soviet effort to turn the tide against the Nazi threat. As Operation Barbarossa unfolded in 1941, the strategic objectives of both the Soviet and German militaries, the Germans having made remarkable advances in the early stages of the invasion, sought to secure a decisive victory by rapidly capturing key Soviet cities and decimating the Soviet military, hoping to deliver a crushing blow to the Soviet Union and end the war in the East. On the other hand, the Soviets, faced with the existential threat of a Nazi occupation, were forced into an unprecedented mobilization of resources, manpower, and ingenuity to mount a defense against the overwhelming German forces. From the outset, the strategic goals of the Germans were to divide the Soviet Union into separate, isolated regions that would be easier to conquer and control. The main thrust of the invasion was aimed at the industrialized Western Soviet Union, including cities such as Kyiv, Leningrad, and, most importantly, Moscow. Hitler's ultimate goal was to capture the Soviet capital. The Germans intended to destroy the Red Army, secure the vital resources of the Soviet Union, and eliminate Soviet resistance to Nazi ideology. German forces also sought to secure the vital oil fields of the Caucasus, an essential component of their long-term strategic goals. The attack on the Soviet Union was not only driven by military objectives, but also by Hitler's ideological belief in the need for Lebensraum, living space, for the German people, at the expense of the Slavic population, whom the Nazis considered inferior. The German strategy relied heavily on blitzkrieg or lightning warfare, which combined fast-moving mechanized infantry, tanks, and air superiority to deliver swift and overwhelming blows to the enemy. The Germans aimed to execute an intense, concentrated assault on Soviet positions, encircling large Soviet armies and destroying them. The strategic idea was to use speed and mobility to avoid protracted battles that could wear down German forces. This approach had proven effective in Poland and France, and German planners believed it would work against the Soviet Union as well. However, what they had underestimated was the Soviet Union's vast size, its harsh winters, and the resilience of its people, as well as the sheer scale of resistance that would be encountered. For the Soviets, the main objective was clear: defend the Soviet state and protect its sovereignty at all costs. However, given the unexpected speed and ferocity of the German assault, the Soviets were initially caught off guard and forced to adopt a defensive strategy. The Red Army, in the early days of the invasion, attempted to maintain a front line across a vast territory, but the speed and scale of the German offensive made it impossible to mount. The Soviet leadership under Stalin was forced to abandon traditional defensive positions and retreat deeper into Soviet territory. As Soviet forces retreated, they adopted a strategy of attrition, using the vastness of their land to their advantage, slowing down the German advance and buying time for reinforcements and more organized counterattacks. At the same time, the Soviets focused on fortifying key cities such as Moscow and Leningrad, hoping to hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. To counter the German mechanized forces, the Soviets quickly realized that they would need to rely on more than just traditional military tactics. Given the enormous scope of the German advance, the Soviet leadership also called upon every available resource, including civilians, to assist in the war effort. The strategy included mass mobilization, with civilians conscripted into auxiliary units to support the Red Army by working in factories, collecting supplies, and reinforcing defense lines. The use of animals, particularly dogs and pigeons, also became a key part of the Soviet strategy to defend the homeland. These unconventional tactics were crucial in the early stages of the war, where the Soviet military was often outmanned and outgunned by the Germans. One of the primary challenges for the Soviet leadership was the question of how to effectively manage the massive front lines while maintaining control over its vast territory. The Soviet Union's logistical capabilities, particularly in the western regions, were underdeveloped, and its supply lines were stretched thin as the German forces advanced rapidly. The retreating Red Army left behind large swathes of territory that were immediately occupied by the Germans, making it difficult to maintain communication and resupply frontline forces. In response, Soviet commanders made use of unconventional means of communication, including the use of messenger pigeons, which would carry vital military messages across enemy lines. These pigeons, trained to fly long distances, proved invaluable in maintaining communication between Soviet forces as they retreated and reorganized. At the same time, the Soviet leadership faced significant internal challenges. Stalin, having purged much of the Red Army leadership in the late 1930s, found himself dealing with an underprepared military command structure. Many experienced officers had been removed from positions of power, and those who remained were often inexperienced or had been placed in command due to political loyalty rather than military. This caused a degree of chaos in the early stages of the war, as the Soviet military struggled to coordinate effectively in the face of the German onslaught. Stalin's leadership, though authoritative, was also erratic, and his decisions often led to confusion on the front lines. Nevertheless, as the Germans continued to advance, Stalin's ability to adapt to the situation gradually improved, and the Soviet war effort became more unified, with greater coordination between military units and a clearer strategic focus. The Germans, meanwhile, had several strategic miscalculations that would come back to haunt them. One of their primary mistakes was underestimating the harshness of the Russian winter. While the Germans had planned for a quick victory, they were ill-prepared for the logistical challenges posed by the cold. The vast distances between German supply lines and the front lines created problems in maintaining the supply of food, ammunition, and fuel, especially as the temperatures plummeted. This logistical strain, combined with the increasing strength of Soviet resistance, meant that German forces were stretched thin and vulnerable to counterattacks. Furthermore, the Germans had underestimated the resolve of the Soviet civilian population. While many Soviet civilians were initially caught off guard by the invasion, they quickly adapted to the realities of war, providing vital support to the Red Army and partisans. The Soviet civilian population, having lived under the harsh conditions of Stalinist rule, exhibited incredible resilience in the face of occupation. In many areas, civilians worked tirelessly to support the Red Army by providing intelligence, acting as guides for Soviet soldiers, and even organizing local resistance movements. The brutal German occupation in Soviet territory sparked widespread defiance, and the civilian support for the resistance movement grew stronger as the war dragged on. The strategic goals of both sides, Germany's goal to quickly destroy the Soviet state and secure vital resources, and the Soviet goal to protect its sovereignty and prevent occupation, were at odds from the outset. The initial German successes, aided by speed and surprise, began to falter as the war reached a stalemate. The logistical difficulties faced by the Germans and the growing strength of the Soviet resistance, both military and civilian, proved to be decisive factors in the eventual Soviet victory. What had begun as an overwhelmingly one-sided invasion became a brutal war of attrition, in which both sides would suffer immense losses. The strategic goals of both nations would ultimately be shaped by these developments, leading to Despite the early setbacks, the Soviet Union began to regroup and adapt, incorporating both traditional military strategies and innovative solutions, including the use of animals like dogs and pigeons. The Soviets were determined to defend their land and their people, and this resolve would prove crucial in the months and years ahead. The outcome of the war, particularly the eventual Soviet victory, was shaped by these early strategic choices and the willingness of both the military and civilian populations to fight back against the German invasion. The early engagements of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 were marked by rapid German successes. The Blitzkrieg tactics, characterized by lightning-fast assaults using tanks, infantry, and air support, caught the Soviet Union off guard. In the first few weeks of the invasion, the Germans advanced deep into Soviet territory, capturing large swaths of land, destroying or capturing entire Soviet armies. The speed and scale of the German attack were overwhelming, and many Soviet forces were encircled and eliminated before they had a chance to mount a cohesive defense. However, the initial shock of the invasion was followed by a crucial shift in Soviet strategy and an eventual change in the fortunes of the conflict. In the first few days of the invasion, the German army struck quickly across the Western Soviet Union. German Army Group North advanced toward Leningrad, Army Group Center moved toward Moscow, and Army Group South moved toward Kyiv and the resource-rich regions of Ukraine. The German forces moved so quickly that Soviet leadership, despite intelligence warnings, failed to take immediate action. The Germans were able to breach Soviet defensive lines with little resistance and quickly pushed forward toward their primary objectives. For the Soviet civilians, the German invasion was an unanticipated catastrophe that left them scrambling to survive the rapid collapse of Soviet defenses. For the civilian population caught in the path of the German advance, the early days of the invasion were marked by a mixture of panic, confusion, and devastation. As the Germans moved rapidly through towns and villages, they inflicted severe damage on civilian infrastructure. Cities were bombed, factories destroyed, and civilians were often left to fend for themselves in the face of overwhelming German forces. The German military, following its doctrine of total warfare, targeted not only military units, but also the civilian infrastructure that supported them, including transportation networks, communication lines, and industrial plants. The bombing campaigns of German Luftwaffe caused widespread destruction in major cities like Kyiv, Soviet civilians, most of whom had never anticipated an invasion, suddenly found themselves in the midst of chaos. As the German army advanced, many Soviet civilians fled their homes, hoping to escape the approaching enemy. Whole families were displaced, and entire villages were abandoned, as the civilian population tried to outrun the rapid advance of the Wehrmacht. For those who could not flee in time, the occupation began immediately with the German army's brutal methods of controlling and intimidating the population. Civilians were subjected to executions, deportations, and forced labor as the Germans sought to eliminate any potential resistance and secure the territory for their own use. In the face of this onslaught, the Soviet leadership under Stalin initially struggled to respond effectively. As Soviet forces retreated, Stalin made the decision to move the industrial base of the Soviet Union eastward, away from the front lines. This strategy aimed to preserve Soviet manufacturing capacity and continue the war effort, even as the Germans advanced. But the strategy was not without complications, and the chaos on the battlefield was compounded by the difficulty of relocating millions of civilians and thousands of factories under harsh wartime conditions. The logistical challenges of relocating both military and civilian infrastructure stretched Soviet resources to their limits, further exacerbating the difficulties of the defense effort. At the same time, the Soviet Union faced another challenge that would directly impact the course of the conflict: the lack of effective communication and coordination between the various branches of the military. The Red Army had been decimated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s, and many experienced officers had been removed from positions of power. The result was confusion on the front lines, with military units often acting independently without clear orders or a coordinated strategy. Despite these challenges, the Soviet leadership began to reorganize and adapt. Stalin, recognizing the grave situation, dismissed several of his generals, some of whom had been purged previously, and sought to replace them with new commanders capable of leading the Soviet defense. By the end of the first month of the invasion, the Germans had made significant progress, advancing deep into Soviet territory. However, as they pushed forward, they faced increasingly stiff resistance. The Soviet Union's ability to absorb the shock of the invasion was beginning to take shape. The vastness of the Soviet Union and its harsh environment presented unforeseen obstacles for the Germans, who were unprepared for the logistical difficulties of such a large-scale campaign. Their supply lines began to stretch thin, and the immense distances of the Soviet landscape, combined with the harsh weather conditions, began to take their toll on the German troops. As the Germans advanced deeper into Soviet territory, they faced mounting challenges in keeping their forces supplied and maintaining their offensive momentum. For the Soviet Union, the early engagements were devastating, but they also highlighted the critical importance of the Soviet people's resilience. As Soviet forces retreated, civilians were called upon to support the military effort. In the face of overwhelming German forces, civilians in the rear areas were mobilized to provide supplies, dig trenches, and build fortifications. In some cases, civilians, including women and children, were trained to take up arms and fight alongside the Red Army. The role of civilians in these early engagements was critical, as they provided essential support to the Soviet military and helped to bolster morale during the most trying moments of the war. While the Germans continued their advance toward Moscow, the Soviet government's decision to move reinforcements, including the Siberian divisions, to the capital marked a crucial turning point. The Siberian divisions, which were experienced in fighting in extreme cold conditions, were seen as a vital resource for defending Moscow against the German onslaught. The arrival of these experienced soldiers on the front lines gave the Soviet military a much-needed boost, and they played a significant role in halting the German advance during the winter months of 1941–42. The early engagements of Operation Barbarossa revealed the severity of the situation for the Soviet Union and its people. Despite the rapid German advance, the Soviets' ability to reorganize and resist provided hope for the survival of the Soviet state. Civilians, who had been caught in the early stages of the invasion, began to play an increasingly important role in the war effort. Their resilience, alongside the adaptation of Soviet military strategies and the reinforcement of key cities, would ultimately pave the way for the eventual Soviet counteroffensive. As the German forces approached Moscow and Leningrad, the civilians living in these cities faced the immediate threat of occupation. But the determination of the Soviet people, who were committed to defending their homeland, would play a critical role in staving off defeat. The subsequent winter, which proved to be one of the harshest in history, would become the defining moment for both the military and civilian populations. As the Soviet Union rallied, the resilience and adaptability of the Soviet people in these early engagements were critical factors that would shape the eventual victory over the German forces. By the summer of 1942, the scale of the conflict on the Eastern Front had reached unprecedented levels, with both the German and Soviet forces entrenched in a brutal struggle that saw massive losses on both sides. After their initial successes, the Germans began to face significant setbacks as the Soviet Union adapted to the ongoing assault and began to regroup. The Nazi invasion, which had initially aimed for a swift victory, was now becoming a drawn-out, brutal war of attrition. For both military personnel and civilians, this phase of the conflict would bring new challenges, crises, and critical decisions that would shape the course of the war. The strategic importance of the region could not be overstated. Securing the oil fields would deprive the Soviet Union of essential fuel supplies and provide the Germans with the resources needed to continue their military operations. Stalingrad, meanwhile, was an industrial hub and a symbolic city, situated along the Volga River, and its capture would not only provide a significant strategic advantage, but also deal a psychological blow to the Soviets. For the Soviet Union, the loss of Stalingrad was unthinkable. The defense of the city became a matter of national pride and survival, and Soviet leadership issued orders to hold it at all costs. Civilians in Stalingrad were pressed into service to build defenses, fortify buildings, and provide support for the Red Army. The city's residents were prepared for a siege, even though they had no way of fully grasping the extent of the destruction that would follow. Stalin, recognizing the gravity of the situation, ordered the immediate defense of Stalingrad, but few could have predicted how intense and prolonged the battle would become. The German assault on Stalingrad began in August 1942, and over the next few months, the city became the site of one of the most brutal and devastating urban battles in history. The Luftwaffe bombed Stalingrad relentlessly, turning much of the city into rubble. Thousands of civilians were killed, while others were forced to live in the shattered ruins, trying to survive amid the bombardment and the increasingly dire situation. German forces, advancing from the north and south, began to encircle the city, cutting off escape routes and trapping Soviet defenders within its boundaries. However, despite the relentless German attacks, the Soviet defenders held firm, demonstrating remarkable resilience and determination. For civilians caught in the middle of the battle, survival became food and water were in short supply, and medical care was virtually non-existent. The harsh winter set in, exacerbating the misery. Starvation and disease ravaged the civilian population, while the constant air raids, artillery bombardments, and street fighting made daily life unbearable. Despite the intense suffering, many civilians continued to support the Soviet military effort. Some worked as stretcher-bearers or acted as messengers, carrying vital information between units. Others were recruited into auxiliary roles, where they helped to build fortifications or transport supplies. Even though many were terrified of the German forces, civilians saw the defense of Stalingrad as their only hope for survival. During this phase of the war, the German army also experienced the beginning of a crisis. The long supply lines stretched too thin, and the Germans, who had initially relied on rapid movement and momentum, found the harsh winter, the Soviet determination, and the sheer scale of the battle made the German assault more difficult than anticipated. The Wehrmacht, unable to break the Soviet defenses, began to experience the first signs of exhaustion and overextension. The operation to capture Stalingrad had become a costly struggle, with both sides suffering massive casualties. The initial German success in pushing the Soviet forces back had now given way to a war of attrition that neither side could afford. As the siege of Stalingrad continued, the Soviets launched a series of counteroffensives that began to shift the balance of power. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet military initiated the encirclement of the German Sixth Army, effectively trapping it inside the city. The Soviet counteroffensive, known as Operation Uranus, was a key turning point in the war. The German leadership, especially Hitler, refused to allow the Sixth Army to break out of the encirclement, leading to the eventual surrender of the German forces in February 1943. The defeat at Stalingrad marked the first major German defeat of the war, and began a new phase of Soviet offensives that would eventually drive the Germans back to Berlin. For the civilians of Stalingrad, the counteroffensive meant that the long nightmare of occupation and siege was finally over, but the costs were astronomical. The city, once an industrial powerhouse, was now a smoldering ruin. The civilian population, which had been reduced to extreme poverty, starvation, and loss, began the process of rebuilding their lives. However, the war was far from over. The devastation left by the siege of Stalingrad had a profound impact on the Soviet population, not only in terms of physical destruction, but also in terms of the emotional and psychological toll of living through such a traumatic event. As the Germans began their retreat from Stalingrad and the surrounding regions, the Soviet Union launched further offensives that pushed the Germans out of the southern Soviet territories and began the long march westward. The German defeat at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a Soviet resurgence on the Eastern Front, and it was soon followed by Soviet victories at the Battle of Kursk and in the liberation of other key cities like Kharkiv and Kiev. The Germans, now on the defensive, began to lose ground, but the fight was far from over. The civilian population, while initially overjoyed by the liberation of their cities, had yet to fully grasp the extent of the war's toll on their lives. The post-liberation period was fraught with challenges, as civilians returned to their destroyed homes, tried to rebuild their communities, and dealt with the trauma of war. The Soviet leadership, while focused on military victory, paid little attention to the humanitarian crisis unfolding among its people. With millions of civilians still displaced, the cost of the war weighed heavily on the Soviet population. Yet, as the war continued, the resilience of the Soviet people became one of the defining features of their struggle against the Germans. The ongoing battle for survival, the daily struggles for food and shelter, and the constant psychological toll of the war would continue to shape the civilian experience for years to come. Despite the tremendous losses, the Soviet population was determined to rebuild, fueled by the belief that their survival and the eventual defeat of the German invaders would restore their strength and honor. The retreat of the Germans from Stalingrad, while a military success for the Soviets, did not mark the end of the suffering for the civilian population. Instead, it was the beginning of a long and painful process of rebuilding, where the scars of war, both physical and emotional, would remain deeply embedded in Soviet society for generations. By the summer of 1943, the tide of war on the Eastern Front had irrevocably shifted in favor of the Soviet Union. The German Wehrmacht, having been forced to retreat after its disastrous defeat at Stalingrad, now faced a brutal series of Soviet offensives that threatened to undo the territorial gains the Nazis had made in 1941. This period marked the peak of the Soviet counteroffensive, during which the Red Army pushed the German forces back across vast expanses of Soviet territory. The civilian population, already subjected to unimaginable hardship during the initial stages of the German invasion, was forced to endure new waves of destruction and displacement. But this time, it was under the banner of liberation. The Soviet Union's initial successes in 1942, especially the victory at Stalingrad, had given the Soviet people a renewed sense of hope. By 1943, the momentum had firmly shifted, with the Red Army gaining ground and forcing the Germans into retreat. As Soviet forces liberated occupied territories, civilians in the rear were confronted with the challenge of rebuilding their shattered homes and communities, all while enduring the fallout from years of occupation and the brutality of war. Yet, while the tide of the war was turning in favor of the Soviets, the human cost of the conflict was far from over. The Soviet victory at the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943 was the first major German defeat on the Eastern Front. The victory, however, came at a tremendous cost. Not only did it signal the beginning of the German retreat, but it also foreshadowed the immense challenges that lay ahead for both the Red Army and the civilian population. While the Germans were driven back from Stalingrad, the situation on the front lines remained fluid and unpredictable, with both sides preparing for a protracted struggle. The first significant Soviet victory of 1943 came at the Battle of Kursk, fought between July and August. This battle, one of the largest tank battles in history, represented a crucial turning point in the war. German forces, hoping to regain the initiative after their defeat at Stalingrad, launched Operation Citadel, a major offensive aimed at breaking through Soviet defenses around the city of Kursk. However, the Soviets, forewarned by intelligence and prepared for the attack, managed to repel the German offensive. The battle marked the last major German attempt to initiate a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, and it was the beginning of a Soviet drive that would push the Germans all the way back to Berlin. For civilians living in the path of the German retreat, the liberation of their homes came with a mixture of relief and continued hardship. As the Red Army advanced westward, civilians who had lived under German occupation for years were freed from the terror of Nazi rule. But the cost of this liberation was steep. The regions that had been occupied by the Germans were now battlefields, and civilian infrastructure was shattered. Homes, schools, and hospitals that had been spared during the initial stages of the invasion were now destroyed during the back and forth of the Soviet-German conflict. For many, the sight of their homes reduced to rubble was a cruel reminder of the devastation wrought by years of war. As the Soviet forces pushed forward, the civilian population was again caught between two warring sides. In the liberated regions, Soviet troops, while offering hope to the civilian population, were not always met with open arms. While many welcomed the end of Nazi occupation, the Soviet Union's return was not always a cause for celebration. Soviet policies of collectivization, political repression, and the return of Stalin's stringent rule meant that civilians, particularly in areas like Ukraine and the Baltics, had mixed feelings about Soviet reoccupation. Nationalist sentiments in some regions grew stronger as local populations sought autonomy after the brutality of German occupation. As the war continued, Soviet forces advanced through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, liberating these areas from German control. The Soviet military had to fight fiercely to liberate these territories, but the cost was high. The civilian population, which had suffered immensely under German occupation, was now subjected to the chaos of war as the front lines moved westward. Large-scale evacuations of civilians, especially from cities like Kiev and Kharkiv, became commonplace as both the Soviets and the Germans sought to control key urban centers. Civilians in these areas were once again uprooted from their homes, forced to flee in the face of advancing military forces. In some cases, entire villages were destroyed by retreating German forces, and civilians were subjected to forced labor or executed for suspected collaboration. The impact of these offensives on the civilian population was profound. Civilians in both the Soviet and German-controlled territories were subjected to mass displacement, forced labor, and brutal reprisals. In the occupied territories, the German policy of scorched earth continued, with entire villages and towns being burned to the ground in retaliation for partisan activity. In the newly liberated areas, Soviet policies of political purges and repression were quickly implemented, and any civilians suspected of collaboration with the Germans were often arrested, deported, or executed. These policies, combined with the devastation of the war, left deep psychological scars on the civilian population. By the fall of 1943, the Soviet Union had regained much of the territory it had lost in the early months of the invasion, but the cost of this progress was staggering. The civilian population, which had already endured years of occupation and war, faced the immediate challenge of rebuilding their lives in a shattered society. The return of Soviet rule was seen as a mixed blessing in many areas, particularly in those that had seen significant collaboration with the Germans. In Ukraine, for example, nationalist groups that had fought alongside the Germans now found themselves opposed by Soviet forces, creating the scale of the human loss during this period was staggering. Millions of civilians had been displaced, and entire communities had been destroyed in the wake of the war. The trauma of occupation and the subsequent Soviet reoccupation left deep scars, not just physically, but also psychologically. Many civilians who had survived the war had to come to terms with the loss of family members, homes, and livelihoods. The process of rebuilding was slow, and for many, the end of the war did not bring immediate relief, but instead a difficult, ongoing struggle for survival. Despite these challenges, the Soviet Union was beginning to emerge as a military powerhouse. The successful counteroffensives, culminating in the liberation of much of Soviet territory, showed that the Red Army had regained its strength and momentum. The strategic objectives of the Soviet leadership were becoming clearer: to push the Germans back and liberate Eastern Europe, while ensuring that the Soviet Union's territorial integrity and security were protected. The fight for the Soviet Union, however, was far from over. The war would continue for another 2 years, with the civilian population once again enduring unimaginable suffering in the final push to victory. By the end of 1943, as the Germans were driven out of key Soviet cities, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. The Soviet Union was no longer on the defensive. It was on the offensive, with the Red Army steadily pushing the Germans back toward the heart of their own territory. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad and the success of subsequent operations, such as at Kursk and Kharkiv, they had endured the horrors of occupation, the loss of loved ones, and the constant threat of death. And now, as the front lines moved westward, they faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in the wake of a brutal and devastating conflict. The peak of the campaign in 1943 was, for many civilians, a period of bittersweet liberation. While the German forces were driven out of Soviet territory, the cost of that victory was enormous. The war was far from over, but the momentum had shifted in favor of the Soviet Union, and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany now seemed inevitable. For the civilian population, the challenge was not only surviving the horrors of war, but also rebuilding their shattered world in the face of continued hardship. By the summer of 1943, while the early months of Operation Barbarossa had caught the Soviet military off guard, the resilience of both the Red Army and the civilian population had begun to show. As the Germans retreated and the Soviet counteroffensive gained momentum, civilians were forced to adapt to a new reality, one in which survival was just as critical as military success. The civilian population, despite enduring unimaginable hardships, played an integral role in the Soviet war effort, especially as the tide of the war began to turn in favor of the Soviets. The impact of the war on the Soviet civilian population was complex. Initially, many civilians were caught in the direct path of the German invasion. Forced evacuations, the collapse of social order, and the immediate threat of occupation became the new normal. As the Wehrmacht pushed eastward, civilians were often left without. The German military, operating under the principle of blitzkrieg, quickly overran large sections of Soviet territory, leaving civilians to fend for themselves. In the cities, particularly in the western regions such as Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, the occupation was marked by extreme brutality. Mass executions, forced labor, and systematic deportations of civilians were common practices, and large-scale atrocities were committed against Jews, Romani people, and political dissidents. In the early days of the invasion, civilians in the occupied territories faced an overwhelming sense of helplessness. With the Soviet military in disarray, many civilians were left to try and survive under the harsh conditions of German rule. Those who attempted to resist were subjected to vicious reprisals. In some cases, entire villages were burned to the ground, and people were shot or sent to concentration camps. However, despite the overwhelming odds, some residents, particularly in rural areas, fled to the forests and remote areas of the Soviet Union, where they could evade German control and survive through guerrilla tactics and support from local partisan groups. These civilians, though often isolated and struggling to survive, would later become part of the larger resistance movement that would grow in strength as the war progressed. The partisan movement was crucial in undermining German control of occupied territories. Partisan groups, made up of Soviet soldiers who had escaped German encirclements, as well as local civilians, engaged in sabotage operations, intelligence gathering, and ambushes of German supply lines. These groups, which operated in the forests and rural areas, were able to disrupt German operations and create a constant state of instability for the occupying forces. As the war progressed, the Soviet government recognized the importance of the civilian-led partisan movements and began to actively support them. In many cases, civilians provided shelter, food, and intelligence to the partisans, often at great personal risk. While the partisan groups were often small and disorganized in the early years of the war, by 1943 they had become a significant force in many regions of the Soviet Union. The partisans launched attacks on German patrols, destroyed bridges and railways, and sabotaged supply lines. These actions had a profound impact on the German military, forcing them to divert resources to counteract the growing resistance. For civilians, supporting the partisans was both a form of resistance and survival, as many felt that they had no other option but to fight back against the German invaders. The support for the partisans grew as the war progressed, and civilians, particularly in areas like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, became deeply involved in resisting the Nazi occupation. In addition to partisan activity, the Soviet civilian population, as the Red Army struggled to replenish its ranks in the early stages of the war, the Soviet government implemented a series of policies to mobilize the civilian population. Women, who had traditionally been excluded from frontline combat roles, were now conscripted to work in factories, farms, and military hospitals. Many women also volunteered as nurses, ambulance drivers, and auxiliary soldiers. Civilians, particularly in the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, worked long hours in munitions factories, producing weapons and supplies for the Red Army. The scale of Soviet industrial mobilization was unprecedented, and civilians, though often working under harsh conditions, contributed directly to the war effort by producing weapons, ammunition, and other critical supplies. As the war dragged on, civilians were also forced to adapt to the realities of constant bombardment, resource shortages, and the devastation of war. The Soviet leadership, recognizing the importance of maintaining morale, implemented a variety of propaganda campaigns to keep the population motivated and focused on the goal of victory. The government emphasized the heroic role of Soviet civilians in resisting the Germans, and the wartime contributions of ordinary citizens were celebrated in posters, films, and speeches. The message was clear: every Soviet citizen, whether military or civilian, had a role to play in the defense of the motherland. This sense of unity, despite the overwhelming hardships, became a driving force behind the Soviet war effort. In many ways, the adaptation of the civilian population was key to the success of the Soviet counteroffensives. As the Germans advanced, the Soviet military, despite initial setbacks, began to regroup. With the support of civilians, the Soviet military launched a series of counteroffensives, pushing the Germans back from Moscow and later the civilian population, though enduring the devastation of war, played a critical role in providing logistical support, intelligence, and moral backing to the military. As the war continued, Soviet civilians became more deeply involved in the effort to push the Germans out of the Soviet Union, whether through direct combat or by supporting the war effort from behind the lines. The civilian adaptation to the war also took on a more somber tone as the Soviet Union transitioned from defense to offense. As the Soviet military began its push westward, civilians living in the newly liberated areas faced the difficult task of rebuilding their lives. The destruction of homes, infrastructure, and entire communities was a constant reminder of the immense toll of the war. Many civilians who had been displaced during the German occupation now found themselves without homes. The difficulties of post-war life were compounded by the psychological trauma of occupation and the brutality of the conflict. Many civilians, having lived through the worst of the occupation and war, now face the challenges of rebuilding their communities while coping with the emotional scars of war. As the war progressed, Soviet leadership continued to emphasize the importance of civilian adaptation and resilience. The wartime sacrifices of civilians were lauded in Soviet propaganda, and the role of the population in the war effort became central to Soviet identity. In the post-war years, the memory of civilian resistance, survival, and adaptation would be an essential part of the narrative of victory. However, it was also a period of profound psychological and physical trauma for the civilian population, whose experiences would remain embedded in the collective memory of the Soviet Union for generations. Ultimately, the resilience and adaptability of the Soviet civilian population during World War II were crucial factors in the success of the Soviet Union's military campaigns. The hardships endured, from occupation to mobilization, shaped the character of Soviet society, embedding a sense of unity and determination that would fuel the drive for victory. Despite the immense toll, both physical and emotional, civilians were an integral part of the Soviet war effort, embodying the endurance that would lead to the eventual defeat of the Nazi invaders. Their sacrifice and commitment were key to the Soviet Union's eventual success on the Eastern Front, and their role in the war effort remains a testament to the resilience of the Soviet people. By the winter of 1942-43, the fortunes of the German Wehrmacht, which had launched a swift and brutal invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 with the aim of destroying the Soviet state, had encountered an unanticipated series of obstacles that weakened their advance. The collapse of the German offensive at Stalingrad, followed by the successful Soviet counteroffensives, marked the first major German defeat on the Eastern Front and set the stage for a series of Soviet victories that would eventually lead to the collapse of Nazi Germany. However, the impact of this turning point was not only felt on the battlefield. For the civilian population, it marked the beginning of a new phase in the war, one that would be defined by liberation, continued hardship, and the complex dynamics of Soviet reoccupation. Stalingrad, the site of one of the battle itself, which lasted for months and saw the near annihilation of the German Sixth Army, was a turning point not only for the military, but also for the civilians living in the besieged city. Throughout the siege, civilians had endured extreme deprivation, suffering from starvation, bombardment, and disease. The German encirclement of the city had isolated Soviet defenders, and the civilian population had been caught in the crossfire between the two warring sides. Many were killed in air raids, artillery bombardments, and street fighting, while others had been forced to live in shelters with little food, water, or medical care. The resilience of the population, however, became a key factor in the Soviet defense, and it was the unity of the Soviet people that helped to turn the tide against the Germans. The victory at Stalingrad was not just a military triumph, but a moral one, providing the Soviet Union with a renewed sense of hope. For the civilian population, it marked the end of the worst period of the war, with the Germans forced to begin their retreat from the Soviet Union. Yet, the battle's aftermath was not a simple return to normalcy. For those who had survived the horrors of the siege, the road to recovery was long and fraught with challenges. Stalingrad, once a thriving industrial city, was left in ruins, with much of the infrastructure destroyed and countless homes, factories, and hospitals reduced to rubble. Civilians who had fled the city were faced with the monumental task of returning to their homes and rebuilding their shattered lives. The Soviet government, recognizing the scale of the destruction, began organizing reconstruction efforts, but these were often slow and hindered by the war's continued demands. In the aftermath of the victory, many civilians were tasked with However, with the war still raging, particularly in the southern regions and around the city of Kursk, these efforts were often interrupted by the needs of the military. Meanwhile, the psychological toll on the civilian population was profound. For those who had witnessed the horrors of Stalingrad and the long months of occupation, the trauma was not just physical, but also emotional. Many civilians had lost loved ones, homes, and livelihoods, and they were now confronted with the arduous process of rebuilding in the face of continued uncertainty. Although the Germans had been driven back from the city, the broader context of the war meant that civilians were still trapped in a world defined by hardship and fear. The Soviet Union, despite its military successes, still faced the ongoing challenge of maintaining civilian morale while dealing with the brutal realities of war. As the Red Army launched its counteroffensive in the winter of 1942-43, the momentum shifted decisively in favor of the Soviets. After Stalingrad, Soviet forces pushed the Germans back across vast stretches of Soviet territory, culminating in the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943, the largest tank battle in history. The German forces, despite launching an offensive aimed at retaking lost territory, were decisively defeated. The battle represented the last major German attempt to initiate a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. For the Soviet Union, it was another resounding victory, and it underscored the growing strength of the Red Army, which had successfully regained the initiative. However, the civilian impact of this phase of the war was multifaceted and marked by both liberation and continued suffering. While the return of Soviet forces brought relief to many, it also created a complicated political and social landscape. Areas that had been occupied by the Germans, particularly in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, had witnessed collaboration with the Nazi occupiers, and many civilians had been complicit in the German-led atrocities. The Soviet reoccupation was not a simple return to Soviet rule. It was marked by purges, political repression, and attempts to eradicate any form of collaboration or resistance to Soviet authority. In the areas liberated by the Red Army, the return of Soviet rule often came with a heavy hand. Civilians who had lived under German occupation faced a new set of challenges as they navigated life under the Soviet regime. Stalin's policies of collectivization and political repression were reasserted, and the return of Soviet power often meant forced labor. The Soviet government sought to reassert control over the population, and the return of Soviet authority was often met with fear and resistance. In some regions, particularly in the Baltic states, nationalist sentiments had grown during the occupation, and some civilians resented the reassertion of Soviet power. This resentment would continue to simmer in the post-war years, contributing to the unrest that would characterize Soviet rule in the coming decades. For those civilians who had endured the worst of the German occupation, the return of Soviet forces was a complicated experience. Many were grateful for the liberation, but the reality of life under Soviet rule was difficult to accept. The war had left deep emotional scars, and the process of reintegrating into Soviet society was fraught with tension and trauma. Civilians who had experienced the horrors of Nazi occupation now found themselves living under the strict control of a regime that had its own set of brutalities. The psychological toll of war and occupation, combined with the political repression of Stalin's government, created a complex legacy for the civilian population. While the military successes of the Red Army were undeniable, the experience of the civilian population during this period was shaped by loss, fear, and the difficulty of rebuilding a life in the wake of such profound destruction. The shift from occupation to liberation did not mark an immediate return to normalcy. Instead, it led to a new phase of suffering and adaptation as the Soviet Union struggled to rebuild its territories while continuing to fight on the Eastern Front. Civilians, though relieved at the defeat of the Germans, now had to endure the challenges of living in a war-torn country, with the looming presence of Soviet repression and the scars of their experience. The turning point in the war, as marked by Soviet victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and in the liberation of Soviet territories, was not just about military successes. It was about the endurance and resilience of the civilian population. For many, the experience of liberation was a bittersweet one, as it represented the end of German occupation, but also the beginning of a new struggle for survival in a world forever changed by war. The human cost of the war, both for soldiers and civilians, had been enormous, and the aftermath would continue to shape Soviet society for years to come. The winter of 1943–44 marked a crucial shift in the dynamics of World War II, as the Soviet Union began to gain the upper hand against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front. The Soviets had dealt a critical blow to the Germans at Stalingrad, and by the spring of 1943, by the time the Germans were retreating from Stalingrad and their southern positions, the Soviet military was pushing forward, reclaiming territory and liberating cities across the Soviet Union. This period, though marked by Soviet victories, was also defined by immense suffering and loss, both for the military and the civilian population. The end of the war on the Eastern Front, while bringing military triumph, also brought with it the harsh realities of reconstruction continued hardship, and the psychological scars of years of war. For the civilians living in the liberated territories, the aftermath of the German retreat presented a complex reality. While the liberation from Nazi rule was celebrated, it also marked the beginning of a new phase of suffering. In the years following the German retreat, the Soviet government reasserted its control over the newly liberated. These areas, particularly in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, had witnessed collaboration with the Nazis, and the Soviet authorities moved quickly to reassert their control. This process was not without significant consequences, as those suspected of collaborating with the Germans were subject to arrest, deportation, and execution. In addition to the political repression, the Soviet government implemented policies of forced collectivization and purges in the newly liberated territories. Entire communities that had supported or cooperated with the Germans during the occupation were subjected to severe punishment. These policies, while intended to secure Soviet control and eliminate perceived threats, caused widespread suffering among civilians. Those who had lived through the brutality of Nazi occupation, the sense of liberation was tempered by the return of Stalinist policies, which included censorship, political repression, and a continued focus on the wartime economy, which remained heavily militarized. The destruction left by the war was staggering. Cities, villages, and towns across the Soviet Union had been decimated by the fighting. In areas like Kiev, Kharkiv, and Stalingrad, entire neighborhoods had been destroyed in the fighting, leaving the civilian population with little more than rubble and ruin. In the occupied territories, the German strategy of scorched earth had left a lasting impact, with entire villages burned to the ground and agricultural land destroyed. The Soviets, while liberating these regions, faced the immense task of rebuilding the economy, infrastructure, and the lives of millions of civilians. The scale of the destruction was so great that it would take decades for the Soviet Union to recover fully. In addition to the physical destruction, the war had also left deep emotional and psychological scars on the civilian population. The horrors of occupation, the loss of loved ones, the destruction of homes, and the trauma of living through years of violence and fear had a profound impact on those who survived. For many civilians, the end of the war did not bring immediate relief. Instead, it meant the beginning of a long process of rebuilding, both physically and emotionally. The trauma of the war would linger long after the fighting had ended, as millions of people struggled to come to terms with their experiences and the loss they had endured. One of the most significant challenges in the aftermath of the war was the issue of displacement. Millions of Soviet civilians had been forced to flee their homes during the German occupation, and many had been relocated to other parts of the Soviet Union for safety. As the front lines shifted and territories were liberated, civilians began to return to their homes, but the journey was fraught with difficulties. Many found their homes destroyed or abandoned, and even those who had managed to survive the occupation often faced severe shortages of food, clothing, and medical care. The Soviet government, while attempting to provide relief, was overwhelmed by the scale of the need, and many civilians were left to rebuild their lives without sufficient resources or support. The Soviet Union's response to the challenges of post-war reconstruction was marked by a massive effort to restore the economy and infrastructure, particularly in the war-torn areas. The government focused on rebuilding heavy industry and military production, which remained a priority even in the post-war period. However, the needs of the civilian population, many civilians were forced to work in harsh conditions, often under duress, to help rebuild the Soviet economy. The collective effort of civilians, working in factories, farms, and the reconstruction of cities, became central to the Soviet government's vision of post-war recovery. Yet, even as the physical rebuilding of the Soviet Union began, the political and social challenges of the post-war period became increasingly apparent. The war had not only destroyed cities and infrastructure, but had also fundamentally altered the social fabric of Soviet society. The loss of millions of soldiers and civilians, the breakdown of traditional social structures, and the trauma of living through the war left a generation of Soviet citizens scarred. The government, under Stalin, sought to maintain control over the population through political repression and the continued purging of perceived enemies. The post-war period saw the strengthening of the Soviet state's totalitarian grip, as Stalin sought to prevent any dissent or challenges to his authority. The immediate consequences of the war were thus twofold. While the Soviet Union emerged victorious, the cost of that victory was immense. The country was left in ruins, with millions dead, millions more displaced, and entire communities devastated. The war had exposed the vulnerabilities of the Soviet state and left a population that had suffered the worst of human violence and cruelty. The return of Soviet authority in the liberated territories was seen by many civilians as a bittersweet victory. On the one hand, they were freed from the horrors of Nazi occupation, but on the other, they faced a government that was just as repressive and brutal in its own way. For the civilian population, the end of the war meant the beginning of a new set of struggles. The focus on rebuilding the military-industrial complex left little room for the immediate relief of the civilian population. Those who had survived the war, now tasked with rebuilding their homes and their lives, found themselves in a country still gripped by fear, political repression, and economic hardship. The war's toll on the Soviet people, though less visible in the years after the conflict, remained profound, and its legacy would shape the Soviet Union for decades to come. In the broader context of the war, the Soviet Union's victory over Nazi Germany was a monumental achievement. The Soviet Union had not only withstood the German onslaught, but had also decisively turned the tide of the war, eventually pushing the Germans back and occupying their homeland. The victory, while a source of immense pride for the Soviet Union, also marked the beginning of a new era, one that would see the Soviet Union emerge as a superpower, poised to shape the post-war order. The legacy of the war, however, was not only about military triumph. The toll of the war on the civilian population, the destruction of Soviet society, and the challenges of rebuilding the nation were profound. For those who lived through the war, the victory was bittersweet. The war had taken everything from them: families, homes, and a sense of normalcy, and its aftermath would take years, if not decades, to recover from. Yet, the resilience of the Soviet people, their ability to survive, adapt, and rebuild would ultimately define the Soviet Union's place in the post-war world. In the years following the war, the Soviet Union focused on its reconstruction, but the emotional and psychological scars of the war remained. The victory over the Germans, though monumental, was paid for in blood and suffering, and for the civilian population, the road to recovery was long and uncertain. The war had left deep marks on Soviet society, and the scars of that conflict would continue to affect the Soviet Union's identity for generations. The conclusion of World War II marked the beginning of a new chapter, not only for the Soviet Union, but for the entire world. For the Soviets, the victory over Nazi Germany was a source of immense pride, a testament to the resilience and determination of both the Red Army and the civilian population. However, while the victory brought military triumph, it also left a profound and lasting legacy that would shape the Soviet Union and its people for generations. The war's aftermath, particularly for civilians, was a complex mixture of relief, grief, and struggle, as the Soviet Union faced the difficult task of rebuilding after a war that had cost it millions of lives and left much of its infrastructure in ruins. The human toll of the war was staggering. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people during the course of the conflict, a number that included not only soldiers, but also millions of civilians who died as a result of German occupation, massacres, forced labor, and famine. The Eastern Front, with its vast battles, sieges, and widespread atrocities, had been a devastating theater of war. Cities were decimated, villages burned to the ground, and the agricultural and industrial bases of the Soviet Union were destroyed. The war had left a permanent mark on Soviet society, altering the course of its development and leaving a legacy of hardship that would continue to affect its people for decades. For the civilian population, the war's aftermath meant facing the physical and emotional scars of years of brutal occupation, forced displacement, and relentless violence. While the German retreat was celebrated as a victory, it did not immediately bring relief. The Soviet government's reoccupation of the liberated territories brought with it not only a sense of relief from Nazi rule, but also the reassertion of Soviet control, which was often harsh and repressive. Stalin's policies, which had been in place before the war, were re-implemented with a vengeance, and many civilians who had been forced into cooperation with the Nazis were punished for their actions. The return of Soviet rule was also marked by a continued atmosphere of fear, as the state sought to consolidate its power over its newly liberated territories. In the liberated regions, particularly in Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, civilians who had experienced years of Nazi occupation now found themselves living under Soviet rule once again. The Soviet government, under Stalin, moved swiftly to eliminate any potential resistance, often through brutal purges. Nationalist sentiments that had emerged during the Nazi occupation were seen as a threat to Soviet unity, and the government responded with force. While some welcomed the end of Nazi tyranny, many others, particularly those in the newly occupied areas, found the return of Soviet rule just as oppressive. The political purges and forced collectivization that had been hallmarks of Stalin's pre-war regime were reintroduced, leading to a climate of suspicion and repression. In addition to the political and social upheaval, the war had left the Soviet Union with significant economic challenges. The destruction of industrial facilities, railways, and agricultural land made it difficult to resume normal production. In some regions, particularly in the Western Soviet Union, the infrastructure was in shambles, and the civilian population had to contend with food shortages, inadequate housing, and a lack of basic necessities. While the Soviet government prioritized rebuilding the military-industrial complex to ensure continued defense preparedness, the needs of the civilian population were often secondary. Millions of people who had survived the war found themselves struggling to make ends meet, rebuilding their lives in a war-torn nation. Despite the immense challenges, the Soviet government launched a massive program of reconstruction. Large-scale rebuilding efforts focused on restoring cities, industries, and infrastructure. Factories were rebuilt, and the Soviet Union's industrial output was revitalized. But the civilian workforce, which had been mobilized during the war to support the military, was now tasked with rebuilding the country. Many civilians, particularly women, continued to work in factories, producing munitions, vehicles, and other supplies needed to continue the war effort. However, the hardships of post-war life were not easily overcome, and many families faced years of deprivation before they could begin to rebuild their homes and communities. For the millions of Soviet civilians who had survived the war, the victory over Nazi Germany came at a tremendous personal cost. The emotional toll of the war, particularly the trauma of living through occupation, loss, and displacement, left deep scars. The psychological trauma was compounded by the strict control of the Soviet state, which stifled the possibility of open discussion of the war's horrors. For many, the war was something to be endured and then forgotten, as the Soviet government emphasized the need for unity and forward progress rather than dwelling on past suffering. In this environment, the stories of civilian suffering and loss were often pushed aside as the focus shifted to the celebration of the Red Army's victory and the ideological triumph of Soviet socialism. The war's legacy also had far-reaching consequences for the Soviet Union's relationship with the rest of the world. In the aftermath of the war, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the two superpowers, alongside the United States, and the global balance of power shifted. The Soviet Union, now strengthened by its victory, sought to expand its influence across Eastern Europe and beyond, establishing satellite states in Central and Eastern Europe, and supporting communist movements in other parts. This marked the beginning of the Cold War, a period of intense ideological and military competition between the Soviet Union and the Western powers. The war had not only redefined the Soviet Union's role on the world stage, but also set the stage for decades of geopolitical conflict. The Soviet Union's military victory over Nazi Germany became a cornerstone of Soviet national identity. The war, referred to as the Great Patriotic War in Soviet propaganda, was celebrated as the ultimate triumph of Soviet socialism and the unity of the Soviet people. Victory Day, celebrated on May 9th each year, became a major national holiday, commemorating the sacrifices made by both the military and the civilian population in defeating the Nazis. The victory was also symbolized by the immense number of war memorials and monuments erected across the Soviet Union, commemorating the fallen soldiers and the heroism of the Soviet people. This narrative of victory, however, often glossed over the immense human cost of the war, particularly the suffering of the civilian population. The post-war period also saw the rise of a new Soviet leadership. While Stalin remained in power until his death in 1953, the aftermath of the war contributed to shifts in Soviet policies. The need to rebuild the nation's economy and restore stability led to some changes in the relationship between the state and the people. However, the legacy of Stalinist repression continued to affect Soviet society, with dissent being suppressed and political opposition remaining dangerous. The trauma of the war and the harsh realities of Soviet rule shaped the lives of millions of Soviet citizens, and the scars of the conflict would not fade easily. In the years following the war, the memory of However, for the civilians who had lived through the war, the reality of post-war life was one of continued hardship, rebuilding, and coping with the trauma of the past. The human cost of the war, particularly for those who had endured occupation, forced labor, and the loss of loved ones, remained a defining feature of Soviet identity. As the Soviet Union entered the Cold War, its